Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online today. My name is Samantha Lau. I'm the Manager of Communications and Operations at the Canadian Water Resources Association. Joining myself today is Meg Olson, our Executive Director, and Emmanuel Sims from Environment and Climate Change Canada. As you are aware, we also have a great speaker lineup today. Melanie Trudel from the University of Sherbrooke and Martin Clark from the University of Calgary. They're both joining us for our webinar as part of the series that we're hosting with the National Hydrological Service on the research conducted through the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program. On to slide 3, a couple of quick housekeeping notes before I move further. We will have presentations in both English and French. Please select the preferred language you would like to tune into for today's webinar using the interpretation button with the globe icon on the bottom of your screen on the control panel. To view slides in your preferred language, please toggle between the shared screens at the top left of your Zoom window. All slides are available in both English and French. Through our Zoom interface, you also have the option to turn on captioning if that would be useful to you. Closed captions are available on the bottom panel, again, with the CC icon. Next slide. As a refresher, and for those who are new to CWRA, the Canadian Water Resources Association is a national organization dedicated to advancing the sustainable management of water resources across Canada. Our members include professionals, researchers, biologists, conservationists, policymakers, and many more, all working together to address critical water challenges. CWRA hosts a variety of events, including webinars like this one today, workshops, and our annual national conference, which will be held in beautiful Penticton, BC this year. If you are enjoying this webinar series, please be sure to check out the other great events available on our website. We will post a link in the chat to our events page. You will also have an opportunity to provide feedback to our team at the end of today's webinar on this webinar series. Next slide. This webinar is part of our 2025 series in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada's National Hydrological Service, or NHS. As part of this exciting series, we are highlighting groundbreaking hydrology and hydraulics research conducted through the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program, also known as FIMP, and showcasing the latest advances in flood mapping science across Canada. This series is designed for flood mapping practitioners, researchers, interested parties, and the general public, offering a unique opportunity to hear from subject matter experts at no cost. These webinars and some of the accompanying materials will be made available in both English and French on our CWRA website after the session. So I'm seeing some familiar and new names joining us today. If you would like to, and we encourage you, please say hi in the chat and share where you are calling in from. As a national organization, we acknowledge that the speakers and our audience joining us here today are all in different locations and on Native land. I myself would like to acknowledge that the land on which I work and play on is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources across the Great Lakes. CWRA has created an Indigenous Relations Committee to support the organization to its work towards reconciliation and allyship with Indigenous peoples in sustainable and effective water management in Canada. This is important to us, and we're committing funding, volunteer, and staff time to this work. We welcome any and all feedback and advice on this journey. Before we dive into today's presentations, I'm pleased to welcome Emmanuel Sims from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Emmanuel will be providing a brief introduction to the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program. So over to you, Emmanuel. I'm not seeing Emmanuel on here. So I can cover some of the overview from her slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview Emmanuel was going to provide on the FIMP program. FIMP was launched in 2021 and 2022, and the continuation of the program was launched in 2023-24, with the current program ending in 2027 and 2028. Natural Resources Canada leads FIMP in close collaboration with ECCC as well as Public Safety Canada. FIMP funds flood mapping projects in close collaboration with provincial and territorial partners. Cost sharing is 50-50 with provinces and 75-25 share with territories. And the breakdown of the program funding on the screen today, the flood mapping projects with provinces and territories are included in NRCan's funding. A goal of FIMP was to contribute funds to research. ECCC funds research streams dedicated in incorporating climate change into flood maps. This webinar series focuses on the outcomes of the research funded by ECCC completed during the first phase of FIMP. NRCan funds research streams related to regional flood modeling and inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledge in flood mapping projects. So on behalf of Emmanuel, we're looking forward to share the outcomes of the research with our community. Next slide, please. The next webinar in the series will take place on March 6th, featuring presentations from Tadros Gabriel and Nicolas Gasset on innovations in predicting ice jam, flooding, and surface reanalysis. For more details on upcoming events, please visit the CWRA website. All right. Okay, so a few more people have joined us. Welcome to the webinar. I just have a couple more notes on housekeeping, a couple reminders around a couple things. Next slide, please, Liz. Just a refresher, make sure that you're listening to the presentation in your preferred language. Interpretation settings as well as closed captions can be accessed on the bottom panel. To view the slide in your preferred language, toggle the slide option on the top left of your screen. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be freely available on our website over the next few weeks. During the presentations, we might post some links as well in case you want to save those to follow up. So check your dashboard in the chat window. In between presentations, we'll take a couple of burning questions, and then we'll take the remainder at the end after the panel discussion. So at any point, if you have any questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A tab on your control panel. If you run into any issues on the Zoom platform, please message us in the chat and we'll try to help you to resolve them. If you find yourself disconnected from the webinar at any point, please rejoin using the same link once you have restored connection. Next slide. Now a quick introduction for our first speaker. Dr. Melanie Trudel is an associate professor in the Department of Civil Engineering and Building Engineering at the University of Sherbrooke. She is an expert in remote sensing of water resources, as well as hydraulic and hydrological modeling. Her research focuses primarily on the acquisition and integration of remote sensing data, both satellite and drone-based, for monitoring water resources. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Trudel. I will pass it over to you for our first presentation.
Thank you. I will first share my screen. Alors, je vais y aller en français.
So I'm going to speak in French. Hope you can see my full screen. Yep, looks great. Perfect. So the project I'm going to talk to you about today is about analyzing the impact of bathymetric data on floodplain mapping. We're in the part of the mapping that concerns hydrodynamic modeling. And hydrodynamic modeling, when it's done using models such as the Hegras model, which is used a lot, will require knowledge of bathymetry, which is the geometry of the river. However, traditional bathymetric data is obtained using cross sections of the GNSS, which can be seen here, or with sonars or ADCP sonars. But these measurements are time consuming and costly. Access to rivers, as we can see here, is sometimes difficult. And you also have to cover very large areas if you want to map on a Canada wide scale. So there are new technologies that are available and that we want to evaluate. And one of these technologies is the topobathymetric LiDAR. The topobathymetric LiDAR, which I will refer to as BTL throughout this presentation, is a LiDAR that to a certain extent allows you to find bathymetry. We're more familiar with the topographic LiDAR, which is in a wavelength called the near infrared, and which is very much used currently to characterize the elevation of the floodplain. But the topographic LiDAR does not give any information about bathymetry. The signal is read and reflected at the water surface. The bathymetric topographic LiDAR also includes a signal in the wavelengths of the glass, and these wavelengths will partially penetrate the water column. I say partly because depending on the depth of the water, turbidity, and the presence of vegetation, the signal will be attenuated, and we won't always get a return from the bottom, so we won't always have the information on bathymetry. An order of magnitude of a few meters will allow us to get bathymetry if there is no turbidity in the water. So acquisition must be carried out in weather conditions that are rain-free, both at the time of acquisition and in the days before, to avoid high flows and water turbidity. And the main issue in using BTL data in hydrodynamic modeling is the percentage of coverage, since we don't have information on the entire river, but we do have additional information compared with traditional surveys on certain portions of the river. So the background of the study I'm presenting today is that it is funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada. But the study was first launched in collaboration with the government of Quebec in 2022 and 2023, where we analyzed nearly 400 linear kilometers of river topobathymetric data in Quebec in very varied conditions, and we assessed the accuracy of the river and the coverage percentage. We have access to a very large quantity of BTL data to do hydrodynamic modeling. And a second part, since the project with Environment Canada has now been completed, a second phase with the Quebec government has just begun to take the results I'm presenting to you today a step further. So there are a lot of unanswered questions that we're going to address over the next 3 years. Our research questions are as follows. how much uncertainty is associated with the source of bathymetric data for floodplain zone mapping. So to what extent do we need good bathymetry throughout the river to produce reliable floodplain maps? And the other question we're asking ourselves is there a source of bathymetric data, a combination of sources of bathymetric data that allows us to have more accurate hydrodynamic modeling by comparing the modeling with water level observations? Our study sites are located in rivers where we have bathymetric data, and for the purpose of this study, we focused on the l'Assomption River, which is located in Quebec, north of Montreal, as well as the Chaudière River, so different sectors of the Chaudière River, which is located south of Quebec City. So we have BTL data. We also have cross-sections made with the GNSS, the standard LiDAR in red light for both sides. We have water level measurements for different flows. So for the Chaudière River, we took spatial water level measurements in the river using a boat, and we got measurements for two different flows. So 150 cubic meters per second, which is more of a low flow, and 1,500 cubic meters per second, which is a higher flow. Same thing for the Rivière l'Assomption. However, it's not possible to easily navigate the southern sectors. So the measurements were taken at the GNSS on the riverbank to measure water levels, again for two flows, 115 cubic meters per second and 250 cubic meters per second. Regarding the characteristics of the sites under study, for the Chaudière River, the data is good. The river is about 100 meters wide, and the l'Assomption is a little less wide. The length of the sections is currently around 4 kilometers for the Chaudière River and 1.6 kilometers for the l'Assomption. What's important is the percentage of coverage of the top BTL LiDAR. So we have 90% coverage on the Rivière l'Assomption. We're really in a sector where the signal covers practically the entire river, whereas for the Chaudière River, we have lower coverage ranging from 45 to 60% of the sector covered. The slopes also vary from one sector to another, and we have cross-sections and sizes of catchment area. The first phase of our methodology involved generating interpolations of bathymetric data. We used 3 different methods: an interpolation method directly with the BTL points, and then we used the Merweight method to do the interpolation. We also interpolated the cross-sections, and the interpolation was done using eGRASS. And finally, we combined the 2 acquisition methods, the topobathymetric LiDAR and the cross-sections in a geographic information system. So just as a reminder for your knowledge, the Merweight algorithm, there are all the similar algorithms to the Merweight algorithm in terms of river interpolation. So what we're going to do is we're going to plot the Thalbeck, and we're going to project it into the new coordinate system which follows the Thalbeck. And so at that point, we interpolate it using a method which can be inverse, which is the Kriging method, and we reproduce it in the original system that follows the Thalbeck, which allows us to interpolate the meanders in the rivers. We've also interpolated the cross sections directly in the model, in the EGRAS model. It enables us to carry out a linear interpolation between cross sections by following the Thalweg and the banks. And we combine the two. In the areas where we have a loss of BTL signal, we use the interpolation with the cross sections. And when we have the information on the BTL interpolation, we use it to put it on top of our interpolation with the cross sections. For the L'Assomption River, as we said, we have 90% coverage. We simply made a kriging to interpolate the points, given that practically the whole river was covered. We then modeled a 1D. We first carried out a 1D modeling for the Chaudière River. We adjusted the Manning coefficient for only two bathymetries, for the bathymetry of the cross sections and for the combined bathymetry. Since we had only BTL data, we did not have good results giving coverage losses. Then we used two different annual exceeding probabilities, meaning 50%, which corresponds to a 2-year recurrence, and 5%, which corresponds to a 20-year recurrence. We also looked at an average flow for the month of February to represent winter flows for modeling purposes in the context of ice jams. So we wanted to assess the impact on the mapping of flood areas in open water, but also the impact of bathymetry in the mapping of flood zones due to ice jams. For the L'Assomption River, we carried out a 2D modeling, and for reasons of time, we're going to continue, but we set the Manning's coefficient to save calculation time. And we will eventually vary the Manning coefficient. However, with this value of the Manning coefficient, we were already having deviations between we were already having satisfactory deviations between the observations and the models. And here again, we're going to compare the elevations for a traditional interpolation by section and a BTL combination, but essentially we are only going to reach the BTL data. I will show you the results of the various interpolations. On the right, what we can see is in the Rivière L'Assomption, is what we call a loss of signal. So in green are the places where the topobathymetric LiDAR will give information, and in red are the places where we have no information from the BTL. On the left, we have statistics for all the rivers. Here we've calculated the deviations between GNSS data for the cross sections and the BTL data. So in general, the results here are very similar to what we find in the literature. So first of all, we find a slightly higher elevation. We see a positive bias on the topobathymetric LiDAR compared to the GNSS sections. And we find an REMSE typically around 15 to 25 centimeters. However, here we have a larger deviation for one of the sectors, the St. Joseph sector, with both a higher REMSE and a higher bias. At the moment, it's hard to say whether it's the GNSS data or the BTL, which is an issue. These are questions we're going to address as the project continues. Here we can see the loss of signal for the Chaudière River. we see that there is much more loss of signal, and we can also see the limits of the hydrodynamic models that have been implemented. And we notice that for the St. Joseph and St. Mary sectors, the downstream boundary is losing signal. So the downstream boundary condition will be losing signal, whereas for the Scott sector, we have a downstream boundary condition which is seen or which is detected by the BTL. Here too, we can see variations in terms of coverage. We can compare the interpolations with the sections with the interpolation of BTL data directly, and it's what we're seeing here on the right. However, what we see is that there are significant deviations for sectors where there is a loss of signal. So when there is a loss of BTL signal, it is more difficult to get a good interpolation. What we noticed is that the BTL data allows us to detect the shoals in the river and so improve our bathymetric interpolation, which is based on the sections. We combined the two interpolations to assess the added value of the BTL data compared with a traditional topobathymetry. Because at the moment, even with 60% coverage, it's not possible to use the BTL data directly in hydrodynamic modeling. We really need a 90% coverage to be able to do that. So what we did was we first of all used the cross-sections to make sure that we had the deepest places in the river, and then we imposed the bathymetric LiDAR on top to capture the different shoals in the river. On the right, you can see different profiles and the source of the data. So when it's deeper, you can see that it comes from the interpolation of cross sections, and when it's shallower, it comes from the bathymetric, from the topobathymetric LiDAR. On the left, we can see that there is still some noise in the interpolation. So for the next phase of the project, we want to investigate different filtering methods. For the moment, the noise hasn't caused us any modeling problems, but we'll still want to filter the data better. These are the results for the 1D modeling for the 3 sectors on the Chaudière River. We did a calibration to use the same Manning's coefficient for both flows of 50 cubic meters per second and 500 cubic meters per second. For the St. Joseph and Scott sectors, we have a downstream boundary condition of normal depth. And for the St. Marie sector, we used an observed water level. The first thing we notice is that we get better accuracy with the combined BTL data than with the traditional method with just cross sections. So adding the shoals, adding the bathymetry from the topobathymetric LiDAR gives us better accuracy. So here is the REMSE in meters between the observations and the simulations. So we can also see that the model performs better at high flow than at low flow. And the impact of adding topobathymetric LiDAR data leads us to the process of adjusting the Manning coefficient and therefore the calibration of the model with lower Manning coefficient values for 2 models out of 3. But for the Sainte Marie sector, we obtained the same Manning coefficient, but despite this, we still have better accuracy. So lower Manning coefficient with the the topobathymetric LiDAR in the study sectors that we studied, better accuracy for a higher flow compared to a lower flow. Here you can see the comparison. The dotted line or the dashed line is the Talvik. Talvik doesn't seem to change much because the Talvik is the deepest part of the river, and what we've added is the shoals. So if I had represented the wetted areas, we would have clearly had wetted areas that were shallower at the bottom with the topobathymetric LiDAR. You can also see the water level observations by boat. We took measurements every 5 meters. All is well represented. You can see how to take measurements at lower flows or at higher flows. The addition of bathymetry allows us to improve our hydrodynamic modeling in many areas, particularly at low flows. This somehow answers our second research question. Do we get a better accuracy for the sectors we've investigated in 1D modeling? Yes. Integrating several bathymetric sources improves accuracy. Does this have an impact on floodplain mapping? We simulated a 2-year recurrence flow, so an annual exceeding probability of 50% and one of 5%. What you can see here is that the flows here are much higher, and we notice that the simulated water levels are lower when the flow is high. We have a smaller surface area, lower water levels, which can be as low as 60 centimeters in the case of the St. Joseph sector. And on the other hand, we have average water levels in February of around 45 cubic meters per second. How can we explain that in certain cases, the addition of a more detailed bathymetry leads to a reduction in the surface area flooded, and for low flow, we have an increase in the water level and therefore in the surface area that will be flooded. Do we have people who can react in the chat or who can describe their experience? Do we have people in the audience who would like to provide an explanation? Can people switch on their microphone or must they communicate in the chat?
If folks are raising their hands, we can allow them to.
Do we get people who are too embarrassed? I'm used to working with students. My question is, why is it that we see an increase in water levels with low flows, whereas with a high flow and the addition of a better bathymetry, we have lower water levels? This can be explained using our Manning's equation, which is the basic equation that will be used in hydrodynamics. The Manning equation includes the Manning coefficient, but it also includes wet areas and the hydraulic radius. So when we have a lower Manning coefficient, as we obtained with the calibration, for high flows, it's this term that will drive the equation. It's this term that will predominate in the equation. So we will see water levels that are higher. Lower with topobathymetric LiDAR data. However, for a low flow, it is the wetted area that will be the predominant term in the Manning's equation. And therefore, the water level would be higher with the addition of the topobathymetric LiDAR. So what we must understand is that the integration of a more detailed bathymetry, which gives us greater accuracy, will not have the same impact on high flows as on low flows. And on low flows or winter flows, for example, it's important as far as mapping ice jams and hydraulic ice jams is concerned. Adding bathymetry doesn't have the same impact on high and low flows. Do we have people who participated in the chat? I saw one participant raising their hand. Anyway, I'll continue. So here is an example for the Scott sector where the simulated water levels with only the blue sections will be higher for high flows but lower for low flows. And on the right, you can see the impact on the floodplain for this particular sector. For the 2D modeling, what we did was we used the same Manning coefficient, and despite that, we obtained higher elevations for the flow of 15 cubic meters per second and lower for the 250 cubic meters per second. But this time, it's not the Manning coefficient that explains the deviation between the two models, but the downstream boundary condition. The downstream boundary condition of the two models is different, given that we have a better characterization with the bathymetry LiDAR. And modifying the downstream boundary condition will modify the downstream sector and have a different impact on the high and low flows in the 2D modeling. So what we can see here is the spatial variations, where the variations are in the river and the deviations depending on if we're using the cross-sections or the topobathymetric LiDAR. Our study has a few limitations or areas of improvement that we would like to look at in the second part of the study with the Quebec government. And I will only name a few of them here. We want to study the impact of the border condition in more detail. If we know the bathymetry at the boundary condition, we want to see if it has a greater impact than elsewhere in the stretch. We're going to study longer stretches of river. We are also going to look at the impact of bridges and shoals. So we need to know the bathymetry in more detail. We want to study the impact of the bathymetry source on the accuracy of the 2D models. We didn't look at that part of the study. We looked at the impact on mapping, but not on accuracy. So we will try to investigate if by adjusting the Manning coefficient, we can get a more accurate model with a better bathymetry. And we want to develop new methods for combining the different sources of bathymetric data, as well as developing acquisition methods. Are we going to start by acquiring the topobathymetric LiDAR? And after this, we will fill in the sectors where we're losing signal with either sound data or GNSS data. So we will look at developing an acquisition method to have the most complete bathymetry in the river. In short, we'll still have a lot of ideas and a lot of simulations for the next few years. We may have, or we may give other presentations in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Trudell, for sharing your insights today. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please be sure to type them in the Q&A tab. That way we can keep track of all of them. So we'll take a couple questions now, and then we will move to our next speaker. But as we mentioned up top, please keep the questions coming. We'll have more time at the end of the webinar to answer them all. So the first question from Max Goldman was using HEC-RAS. When using HEC-RAS, why was a 2D model used rather than 1D? Do you expect that developing a detailed 1D model could potentially provide different outcomes?
Donc,
We used both. We used ECRAS for both 1D and 2D modeling.
1D and 2D modeling. The 2D modeling,
particulièrement dans le secteur où on faisait
was
l'analyse
particularly
avec
used
des îles et puis des petits chenaux.
for
Donc,
areas where there were islands. So for us, it sounded more appropriate than a 1D modeling. So we have different sectors where we've used the 1D modeling for more traditional areas. But yes, we've used both 1D and 2D modelings. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. Emmanuel, I'll pass it to you to take the next question from Tamsin.
Oui, on a une question en français. Il est très intéressant de voir
Yes, we have a question in French. It's interesting to see the progression of the BTL technology, especially given that BTL still has a few limitations, including deep waters. Do you see a potential to combine BTL with historic sections in order to efficiently develop new hydraulic models and floodplain mappings? Yes, of course, we're moving toward data combination. What is important is the rapidity of the acquisition of the BTL data. We can also detect changes in the shoals because this is the portion that we usually detect with the BTL data. That is what we're currently doing. We combine cross sections and we try to see if they're historic. Sometimes they're acquired at the same time as the BTL data, but sometimes they enable us to compare with the historic data. But yes, definitely, we are seeing a potential for a combination between all bathymetric data sources acquisitions.
Est-ce que je peux répondre rapidement à la question de Marc-Olivier
Can I answer Marc-Olivier Trottin's question, which is related to this question? Yes. Yes, maybe I can read the question aloud. Have you developed a screening method to identify the sections where the BTL model will be more efficient? Yes, that was the first step we carried out. The idea is to know in advance if we could have BTL data. The method was developed and the government of Quebec has applied it for its BTL acquisitions. The method was developed, and for the next step of the acquisitions, they applied the method, and it was a success. The paper is being written, and it will eventually be published, but it's a method that is going to be easily applied. And yes, we can also do this by drones. I had a question. I had someone asking if BTL data could be collected by planes or by drones. Yes, it is collected in majority by planes, but it can also be collected by drones. The cost is still high. That is why the data is mostly collected by planes.
We'll
Est-ce
take
qu'il reste du
one
temps?
last
Non?
question from Wes. How did you set the downstream boundary condition for each reach?
Donc, la condition frontière aval, on l'a
The
définie
downstream
en
boundary
ajoutant
condition was
normal
defined
depth,
by
valeur
adding
normale pour
a
un des
normal
secteurs.
depth
Pour l'autre
for
secteur, c'est une
two of the
observation.
sectors.
Pour
For
le
one
secteur de
sector, we
l'Assomption,
did
c'est
observation.
une
For the
observation.
l'Assomption
Pour
sector,
répondre
we
rapidement à
did
l'autre question qui est dans le même
observation.
domaine,
To
which type
rapidly
of
answer the
solution
question which is
provides
related to
steady
this,
state or unsteady state, c'est du steady state for 1D model and two unsteady state for unsteady flow for 2D model. Mais ils sont reliés, ces deux questions.
Excellent.
both questions are interconnected.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Trudell, for sharing your insights today. Just a reminder, please keep them coming in the Q&A tab. We will have more time at the end of the webinar. Our second speaker is Dr. Martin Clark. Dr. Clark is a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering, Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. He is also a Schulich Research Chair in Environmental Prediction and the Executive Co-Director of the United Nations University Hub at the University of Calgary. Dr. Clark was elected Fellow of the American Geophysical Union in 2016 and previously served as the Editor-in-Chief for Water Resources Research. Dr. Clark has dedicated his career to advance the science and practice of environmental prediction. His research group builds large domain terrestrial systems models that are used for a myriad of applications, including environmental forecasting, climate impact assessments, and Earth system prediction. Over his career, he has authored or co-authored over 250 journal articles since receiving his PhD in 1998. We are grateful for Dr. Clark for his time presenting with us today. Over to you, Martin.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. Perfect. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Before I begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 7 territory and the homeland of the Métis, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney, and the Blackfoot. And I thank these nations for their care and stewardship over this land and water, and I pay my respect to the ancestors of these places. I want to talk to you today about some of the work that we're doing in large domain hydrological prediction. In our research group, we build mechanistic models of terrestrial system processes for large geographical domains. We use these models to predict floods and water availability on timescales from seconds to seasons, and to predict threats to water security on timescales from decades to centuries. For the topics today, I want to provide some background as to how we think about hydrological modeling on the larger spatial scales that we work with, some of the research challenges that we're facing on geospatial intelligence, process representation in models, and model data fusion, and some closing remarks. When we're thinking about hydrological modeling, often in the literature and the textbooks that are out there, is the dominant historical perspective is rainfall runoff modeling. Some of the critical questions are, where does water go when it rains? How long does water reside in the catchment? And what flow path does the water take to the stream? These types of questions are relevant for this environment. This is a picture of the Maharangi catchment in Northland, New Zealand. But perhaps the dominant historical perspective is less appropriate for this environment, this environment, this environment, this environment, this environment, and this environment. And really the challenge that we have when we're working with large domain modeling and building nationwide prediction systems is to think of the suite of terrestrial system processes that shape extreme hydrological events across different corners of the continent. So the key question for us is how we model the terrestrial component of the water cycle. And really we're going from the traditional models of hill slopes that we see in a lot of the catchment hydrology textbooks, and more to a comprehensive view of the water cycle. What I'm showing on the right is the new representation of the water cycle that was developed by the USGS, where they're attempting to provide a much more comprehensive view of the dominant processes that we need to include in our models. Groundwater appears in the diagram a lot more prominently. A lot of the cryospheric processes that we experience in Canada, much more prominent urban areas, much more prominent agriculture, etc. What we're interested in is explicitly simulating the dominant hydrological processes from the top of the vegetation to the depth of active bedrock, and from hill slopes to continents. These guiding questions have been quite old. What I'm showing here is a blueprint for a physically based, digitally simulated hydrologic response model. This is the blueprint that underpins a lot of the complex hydrological models that are available today. Fries and Harlan, 1969. I don't want to focus on the blueprint per se, but what I want to focus on are the questions that Fries and Harlan posed when they developed their blueprint. Their first question related to processes, physically based mathematical descriptions of hydrological processes available. Their second question related to parameters. Is it possible to measure or estimate accurately the controlling hydrologic parameters? And the third question related to computing. Have the earlier computer limitations of storage capacity and speed of computation been overcome? Now, I'm arguing that a lot of the challenges that we have today map directly to the modelling challenges expressed by Fries and Harlan, 1969. Many of our models do not represent the dominant processes. The spatial gradients that drive flow occur at very small spatial scales, not resolved by even the finest terrain grid used in large domain hyper-resolution models. In terms of parameters, there's the famous paper by Jim Kirchner, published in Water Resources Research in 2006, where it's on getting the right answers for the right reasons. He talks about models as mathematical marionettes that dance to match the calibration data, even though their underlying premises are incorrect. We've got a lot of problems with compensatory parameters in our models, and that can compensate for weaknesses in the model structure and biases in our forcing. And our vegetation and soils data have limited resolution and information content. In terms of computing, we've seen rapid advances in computing capabilities. That's been true, especially the capabilities for GPUs that we're seeing now. But often we're pushing our models to their computational limit, such that we can only afford a single deterministic model simulation, and we're sacrificing a lot of opportunities that we have for model analysis, model improvement, and uncertainty characterization. The research challenges that we have, just provide a smattering of examples here, touching on some of the work that we're doing in geospatial intelligence, process representation, and model data fusion. This diagram here expresses a lot of the work that we're doing in our research group. We're seeking to advance our information on the data that we use as input to our models, spatial meteorological fields, workflows, the geospatial analysis that we do for global hydrography data sets, spatial discretization, etc. A lot of the work that we're doing on terrestrial system modeling to advance the computational infrastructure of our models. I'll touch on that a little bit, and to improve the process representations. And a lot of the work that we're doing in model data integration for parameter estimation, data assimilation, and model evaluation and benchmarking. A lot of the fundamental model development activities that we're working on in each of these three areas are feeding into our work on environmental forecasting, climate change assessments, and Earth system prediction. So as we're starting here for spatial meteorological fields, we use in a lot of our work the gridded meteorological data that have been developed by different groups around the world. A lot of these data sets have got a lot of uncertainties. So what our approach has been develop new probabilistic spatial meteorological fields where we explicitly represent the uncertainty that we have in the meteorological forcing to our models. This is work that's been done by Go-Chang Tang, who's now a professor at University in China. We've developed the ensemble meteorological data set for North America, where we've got 100 ensemble members at 10-kilometer resolution over the continent, so that we can use all of these ensembles as input to a model and quantify the impact of meteorological uncertainty on the hydrological simulations that we're making at larger spatial scales. We've also developed a global data set that's getting quite a lot of uptake. This is EM Earth, the ensemble meteorological data set for planet Earth, where we've been combining station data with numerical weather prediction model reanalyses to provide probabilistic estimates of the forcing data that's used as input to our hydrological models. We've also been working on model workflows, and this is a lot of work that's been done in collaboration with Professor Elaine Petronero at the University of Calgary. We're interested in data agnostic workflows and model agnostic workflows. The value proposition here is that historically it's taken people a really, really long time to configure models. Often people are spending 90% of their time wrangling data and configuring their models, leaving only 10% of their time for the science and applications tasks that are at hand. Wouter Knurban and our group has done a lot of work on developing model agnostic workflows to increase the transparency, reproducibility, and importantly, the efficiency of the workflows that are being developed. A lot of this work now has been extended by Kasra Keshava's, and he's been taking the work that Wouter has done on developing model agnostic workflows, pulling together a lot of automated tools for spatial data pre-processing, forcing preparation, temporal aggregation, etc. He's been developing these workflows in a model agnostic way that he's applied to 3 major models that have been configured over the North American continent. A lot of the work is tailored and available on the high-performance computing systems that are available in Canada. And Kasra has recently extended these workflows so that they're HPC agnostic and working on a number of HPC platforms across the North American continent. Our work on workflows has been extended by Daria Athorson, who's a postdoc in our group. And Daria has been building on a lot of what Kasra has done and pulling together a lot of tools that bring us from A to Z of hydrological modeling, going from everything from the terrain analysis that we start with, the model configuration, the data processing tasks, the model execution, and the benchmarking and parameter estimation, model optimization and evaluation. This is his Confluence workflow that we're in the midst of preparing for publication. One of the things that Dari's done that I haven't mentioned here is developing AI assistants that can automate some of the human-intensive tasks in developing the workflows. In terrestrial systems modeling, a lot of the work that we've been doing has been to advance the computational infrastructure. And when we're thinking about building a model, we consider the following hierarchical organization. We're at level 1, we can have a large domain hydrofabric, where the domains spatially delineated into subbasins. Here's an example here for the North American continent, where we're using the Merit Hydro product that provides about 500,000 delineated subbasins across the continent. I'm zooming in here to the Merit Hydro subbasins for the Bow River above the township of Banff in Calgary, Alberta. At level 2, each subbasin is delineated into 1 or more land units that represent hydrologically distinct subbasin areas. At level 3, Each subbasin tile is defined by multiple vertical subdomains, vegetation, snow, soil, etc. In level 4, there can be multiple state variables in each of the vertical subdomains, mass, energy, etc. And at level 5, we've got flux calculators that calculate the fluxes at the boundaries of the model control volumes. So when we're thinking about a model design here I'm showing the 5 different levels in the hierarchy, where the first 2 levels define the spatial heterogeneity and the last 3 levels define the vertical column. It's possible to build a general interoperable framework where we can begin to mix and match components from different models. So example, we can define the components in a hierarchical framework where we've got different components for vegetation, snow and soil, or different components for the mass and energy balance for vegetation, snow and soil. So we're trying to build models as composable components, and we're being very careful in the way that we separate concerns. So we're separating the flux equations from the state equations, so that people with expertise in specific areas can apply that expertise to the model development. An example of the separation of concerns is that when we're thinking of a general state equation, where the change in storage with time is equal to the sum of the fluxes at the boundaries of the control volumes that we define within the system, hydrologists can worry about how to obtain the fluxes at the boundaries of the control volume, and numerical analysts can worry about how to obtain the change in storage over a discrete time interval. So this modularity separates the physics from the numerics in the system, and now enables us to use industry standard solvers for our North American simulations. Here I'm showing an example with the different backward Euler solvers run in 1 time interval, 16 time intervals, 32 time intervals, and compared with the industry standard sundials, showing the accuracy, and this is the numerical accuracy of runoff simulations across the North American continent. And we're also working to improve process representations. Part of the work that we're doing, this is from Wouter Knerben again, is a continental domain synthesis, where we're trying to define unique hydrological landscapes across North America and develop perceptual models for each of these landscapes. Here's an example here of the landscapes that we've defined across the continent, and the development of this map was based on extensive consultation with field scientists in different regions across North America. We're also working on models that have processes that have hitherto been neglected in our models. If we're looking at model skill across large domains, we're seeing that models are typically worst in the northern Great Plains and the prairie pothole regions. And this region is characterized by numerous potholes, and often the prairies are defined as the graveyard of hydrological models. The key challenge here is the nonlinear and hysteretic relationship between basin storage and contributing area. In many catchments, the contributing area is constant, but in the prairies, the ponds act as gatekeepers, the depressions act as gatekeepers, and the contributing fraction of the catchment changes with the volume fraction of water in the catchment. So as an example here, as the ponds are beginning to fill, we get some of the catchment contributing flow, more of the catchment contributing flow, more of the catchment contributing flow. But as the storm ends, the water can evaporate or drain from the bottom of the pothole. The water level can drop below the sill of the pothole, and the catchment can no longer produce flow. So these nonlinear and hysteretic relationships between volume fraction and contributing fraction are not included in a wide range of existing models and explaining reasons for the failure. A lot of work from a postdoc in our group, Mohammed Ahmed, has been looking at simulations using different representations of prairie pothole dynamics. The first is WATROF, which doesn't represent potholes at all. The second is PDM-ROF, which has got non-hysteretic potholes. And the third is the hysteretic depressional storage algorithm, which represents the nonlinear dynamic relationship between volume fraction and contributing area. What we're showing here is the Klein-Gupta efficiency measure of model skill, showing that results are much better when we include the hysteretic and nonlinear relationship between volume fraction and contributing area. We're doing a lot of work on parameter estimation. When we're thinking about this, it's useful to look at the approach in the United States of America. Their approach has been hyper-resolution prediction to try and provide predictions for 2.7 million stream reaches across the contiguous United States. This is a paradigm that's been pushed forward about 15 years ago. This is a paper by Eric Wood, another paper by Mark Birkins. The paradigm has been critiqued because of some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier when talking about Fries and Harlan's blueprint, is that we often don't have the data and the compute resources to estimate the large number of uncertain model parameters. This is the problem of hyper-resolved ignorance, as it's been described in the literature. The Earth system paradigm, the hyper-resolution paradigm, overlooks a lot of hydrological realities, where we know as hydrologists that modeling the terrestrial water cycle depends on the unknown details of the landscape. That stream flow predictions require representing the large-scale impacts of spatial heterogeneity. That increases in horizontal resolution often don't lead to increases in model performance. That's quite different than numerical weather prediction models, where you can resolve more processes as you increase the model resolution. And the overall challenge that we have is to infer parameters from limited data. And the traditional parameter estimation schemes were not up to a level for large domain simulations that we needed them to be in order to support this hyper-resolution paradigm. Recently, we're seeing a lot of movement away from the paradigm. If we're providing a synthesis of papers that have been published over the last 5 to 10 years, we're seeing that the accuracy of the national water model is much lower than the accuracy of bucket-style hydrological models and much lower than machine learning algorithms. What I'm showing here is the CDF of skill for these different classes of models. So as the curves are further to the right, the model performance increases. So the concern is that hyper-resolution models like the initial instantiations of the National Water Model in the US has reached its limit of predictability. And there's been a commitment to improve model accuracy, primarily by considering more parsimonious modeling alternatives. The one thing that is now just beginning to be considered is using some of the approaches for big data machine learning to estimate parameters in these more complex models. This is an approach here where we've got a large sample of catchments across the United States. And this is a method that was developed by Andy Wood at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So he's got a number of parameter sets, including geophysical attributes and model parameters, which are mapping onto objective function. And he's got these parameter sets for a number of basins across the continent. And what he's doing is using a random forest as an emulator of the objective function surface and using a genetic algorithm to refine the ensemble of model parameter sets. When he's applying these methods across the CAMELS data set, which is a key test base, the CDFs that he's getting, which are to the right, are very, very similar to the CDFs that he's getting from machine learning algorithms. what I'm showing here is the skill that is getting from model emulators that are applied to a single site on the left and to a large sample of catchments on the right. And it's not shown here, but the skill that we're getting here is very, very similar to the LSTM type models that have been applied over the camels data sets. Like similar skill, when we're looking at independent data and the validation periods. What we're seeing in research out of our groups is that when you're using these random forests as emulators, the drop in performance from calibration to the validation period is a lot lower. And we're thinking that this is because we've filtered out a lot of noise in the data sets that we're using. So what we're seeing now is that we're thinking that the paradigms are shifting. A year ago is what I showed a couple of slides ago. And today, what I think that we're seeing is convergence of the skill of a variety of different modeling approaches, in large part because we're learning more about how we can use big data as part of the parameter estimation process. So in terms of some closing remarks, our goal as we're moving forward is to try to unify state-of-the-art modeling capabilities into interoperable software that can be used and extended by modeling groups around the world. A lot of what I was showing was model agnostic workflows, generalized model design, generalized methods, etc., that can be used across a range of different models and model frameworks. And we're trying to provide the computational infrastructure that enables groups around the world to contribute the unique data, information, and knowledge to a community modeling ecosystem. The outcomes are that the collective community capabilities that we develop can exceed the modeling capabilities of individual groups, agencies, and nations. And this can revolutionize the capabilities for groups around the world to provide the predictive information that supports mitigating and managing some of our most critical water crises. When we're thinking about this, we're really viewing it as a scientific revolution in hydrological prediction. If we're going back to Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, he's defining a paradigm as a philosophical framework that's shared by researchers that defines the commitments, theories, values, and research methods that constitute legitimate contributions to the field. A paradigm shift occurs, as we're seeing, where we're pivoting to a new philosophical framework when an existing paradigm has ceased to function adequately. And what Kuhn argued in his book several decades ago was that scientific progress occurs more through paradigm shifts than through traditional development through accumulation. And that paradigms gain their status because they're more successful than their competitors in solving a few problems that the group of practitioners has come to recognize as acute. So as we're moving forward and we're thinking as to how our work is transitioned to operations and how operations work is beginning to guide our research, we're thinking about the timescale to impact. We're thinking about a lot of the work that we do on short timescales can be to fix bugs, on medium timescales can be to develop algorithms, and on longer timescales, which may go beyond the funding that we have available, is to shape paradigms. And I'm arguing that as we're in the midst of fairly massive changes in the hydrological prediction landscape, that we need to think more carefully about how we're shaping paradigms. So we can akin the research to operations to research process as similar to atmospheric turbulence, and borrow a poem from Lewis Fry Richardson that he published in 1920. Big whirls have little whirls that feed on their velocity, and little whirls have lesser whirls, and so on to viscosity. So I'll end there, and then hopefully we can have some good discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, for your great presentation. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A tab. I see we have one question from an anonymous attendee. If we see machine learning models outperforming physically based or bucket type models, what role do you see physically based models playing in the future?
So this has been one of the major changes that we've seen over the past couple of years. Yes, a year ago, we saw machine learning models outperform physically based models and bucket style models. That was very clear. Some of the work from Gray Nearing showed that very, very clearly. The problem hasn't been, in my mind, so much with the physically based or bucket style models that are used, but more how they're calibrated. One of the really interesting things from Gray Nearing's 2021 paper was that the skill of machine learning algorithms was much higher for regional calibration than it was for single site calibration. There's been a paper recently that's published in Hydrology and Earth System Science that's called, it's by Freddie Kratzer at Never Train an LSTM on a single basin. And he's showing that big data is really needed to estimate the parameters in these machine learning algorithms. What we're seeing in the hydrology community is the opposite relationship. We have the paradigm typically of calibrate then regionalize. So we calibrate our models for individual basins and then try to regionalize the model parameters. When we do that, the regionalized relationships are contaminated by the noise and the calibration data, and a lot of the regionalized relationships are quite weak. So what we see in contrast to machine learning is that the single site calibrations are much better than the regional calibration. The change that we're seeing that Andy Wood has been able to push forward is that if we're beginning to use big data approaches, use effectively, the machine learning approaches as part of to estimate the parameters in our models, the skill of the physically based models is very, very similar, very, very close to the machine learning models. The gap hasn't been closed completely, but there's been a lot of convergence that we've seen.
Thank you. Another question in the chat from Maritza. Can you comment on the value of higher spatial resolution for topographic representation of snowy mountains and realistic representation of the snowpack and snow processes?
Yeah, I can. The key guidance that I can provide is to be clever about our spatial discretization. The simplest approach for spatial discretization is to drape a high resolution grid over the landscape. When we do that, there can be a lot of redundant calculations. And there are some processes that do need to be represented explicitly, and we can represent those processes much more effectively by breaking up our catchment into hydrologically similar areas and ensuring that that the processes are represented in those areas. The key thing that we need to consider is what processes are represented explicitly in our models and what processes are represented implicitly in our models. So you can think of, we've got a catchment and we can break that up into elevation bands where we're explicitly representing the transition between rain and snow in each of the elevation bands. But in each of the elevation bands, we may have a subgrid probability distribution that represents the spatial variability of snow in a way that enables us to simulate the deep snow drifts that persist late in the summer and do a much better job in simulating the magnitude, timing, and duration of snowmelt runoff.
Thanks, Martin. I don't see any more questions, so at this time, I'll invite Meg as well as Melanie to turn on their cameras for our panel discussion. Our team has prepared a couple of questions for the speakers to learn more about their work and hear some more of their valuable insights. And I'll pass to Meg for the first question.
Thank you, Sam. The first question we have, I will direct it to Martin, and then if Melanie does want to weigh in, you're absolutely welcome, Melanie. So for Martin, how do you see your research influencing policy decisions related to flood risk management and environmental prediction?
Okay, thanks. That's a good question. For flood risk management, a lot of what we're working on now is taking a lot of our large domain modeling tools and using them to provide scenarios of stream flow nationwide. So that's been an approach that historically has been piecemeal, catchment by catchment, not a lot of spatial consistency. So we're able to use common approaches in order to do that. A lot of that work is being led by Al Petronero at the University of Calgary. For environmental prediction, what we're interested in is large domain hydrological modeling and working out some solutions to large domain hydrological modeling in a way that provides some spatial consistency in the forecast. I showed a lot of that in the slides that I presented. What I didn't show a lot about and just touched on it towards the end is the community of practice. So what we see is that in Canada, the hydrological prediction landscape is rather fragmented. Different approaches being used by different provinces and territories, different approaches used by universities, different approaches in Canada than are being used by their forecasting agencies in the United States. And different groups have got specific expertise, but that hasn't been unified in a meaningful way. So what I think a lot of our work is pushing towards is the capabilities to think about how we can bring these systems together and do a much better job of sharing code and concepts across different model development groups so that we can take advantage of the economies of scale that we have in hydrological prediction.
Thank you. That's really interesting that it's starting in the community of practice and then maybe moving out into policy decisions.
Je peux ajouter aussi l'acquisition
If I
de,
may
dans la même
add,
direction,
in this
l'acquisition
same way,
par
acquisition
télédétection
of
sur des grands
data by
territoires,
remote detection in
permet
large
de
territory. This
justement
allows
avoir
us
une
to
modélisation
have
plus
a
uniforme
more
sur l'ensemble du
uniform
territoire canadien,
modeling
ou du
all
moins
throughout
sur
Canada, or
l'approche
at
par bassin
least
versant. Donc, on a souvent
on
eu
a
des
watershed
approches
approach.
de modélisation
We often had
hydrodynamique
modeling
vraiment
approaches
par petits tronçons de rivière.
that were in
Donc, avec toutes
smaller
ces données
sectors of river,
acquises
but
par
with all
les
the data
satellites, les
acquired by the
drones,
satellites and
on
the
voit que
drones,
de plus en plus
we
les
see that
politiques
the more and more the
cartographie des zones
policies, the mapping
inondables
policies
vont
of the
sur une
flooding
approche
zones are
globale du
moving
territoire
towards a
qui soit
global
plus
approach over the
optimum.
territory since we have
Donc
more
encore là, c'est dans
observations.
la
Once
direction d'avoir
again,
quelque chose d'uniforme,
we need
quelque chose
something that's
qui va être
standardized
cohérent
and that will be
à l'échelle du
consistent
bassin versant.
all throughout the watersheds.
Merci, Melanie.
Thank you,
I think we
Melanie.
have the next question from Emmanuel.
Yeah, so both your research spans multiple disciplines. How can engineers, hydrologists, policymakers, and community stakeholders work together to apply your findings effectively?
Melanie, would you like to go
Yeah.
first?
Je peux y aller.
Yes, I can jump in. So I'll talk about the question of collaboration between the different players from the standpoint of the bathymetric data. And I want to launch a message. I'll take this opportunity. This is why we have these forums in hydrology. The basic data, for example, the digital elevation model or the occupation of the territory, that's available. We can download it and create a hydrologic modeling. In hydrodynamic modeling, we need bathymetry, and this data is not easy to obtain. It's not public. We cannot use a database and download the bathymetric data to move science forward in hydrodynamic modeling. But the different players, the engineering firms, the governments, the municipalities, they take these measures, but they don't share them. And this slows things down. So one way to improve things and to collaborate all together would be to have databases in terms of bathymetry. And we can also follow up over time. And we could see the morphological changes in the rivers. So we would win in having all of the community in every sector in sharing bathymetric data. But we know that this is a measure that is costly and it is not shared, but it would be great to have an infrastructure to welcome this. That's my comment.
Thank you, Melanie. Yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Sorry, Sam, did you want to say something?
Nope, please chime in.
Okay, no, very good. I completely agree. I'd like to have a slightly different tack as well. A lot of what we're trying to do and the models that we develop and the workflows that we develop is to separate concerns. So in many respects, this is the antithesis of collaboration because we're trying to carve off pieces of the modeling ecosystem and carve off pieces of the model where people can provide their unique expertise. So we need applied mathematicians who are interested in numerical solvers, for example, to contribute to that part of the model, and they need not know the specific details of the physics routines in the model. Or if we're working in the workflows, that we're developing the workflows in a sufficiently modular way so that we can have geospatial scientists apply their expertise in a meaningful way. So I think that's really important, is that it's a wicked interdisciplinary problem. You know, there's so many people from different disciplines, you know, coming together. And it's difficult to have everybody be an expert at everything. So we need to be able to carve up the space in a way that enables people to contribute their unique data, information, knowledge, etc. You know, where it's most useful. In terms of applications, which was the other aspect of the question, a lot of what we're trying to do now is hide the complexity. So we don't want to shy away from complex models because they've got more data requirements and you know can take longer to run. What we're trying to do is to enable those models to be configured much more quickly, to enable the models to be run more effectively, you know, with less human input, so that we can benefit from the complexity, we can benefit from the process understanding without a huge amount of additional work.
Thanks both. My next question is directed to both speakers, and it goes like this. So what emerging technologies or methodologies do you believe will have the most significant impact on your field in the next decade? What are you excited about?
I can go. Mon domaine de recherche, c'est vraiment
my field of research is really acquisition and integrating data in remote detection and different observations to improve both hydrologic modeling and hydrodynamic modeling. The challenge is often access to rivers and access to the territory and the costs that are related to this. So with the teledetection, we could cover a larger territory. And more we see data acquired by drones, both for the levels of waters for standard LiDAR to see the morphological changes in rivers. Today I was presenting on the aerial data, so by plane and the topobathymetric LiDAR, but we also have satellites. And which technology will change significantly our way of working on hydrology and hydraulics is the new SWAT satellite, on which my team has been working on for 10 years. This satellite, it's a collaboration between the NASA, France, the Canadian Space Agency, and the UK Space Agency. And for the first time, we're measuring water levels for every lakes of larger than 6 hectares or larger than 50 meters. So essentially, we have one measure, a weekly measure. It will depend on sectors, and it's 21 days to revisit with overlap. Every 6-hectare lake or more in Canada are visited often with a vertical precision around 10 centimeters. We're talking about 1 million lakes in Canada. And 50-meter rivers, we're talking about 150,000 linear kilometers in Canada. I think that this data in my sector, which is teledetection, will change significantly our way of working on hydrology and hydraulics in the next decade.
Martin, did you want to chime
Yes,
in more?
yes, certainly. From my perspective, and I think this is an amplification of the answer to the anonymous attendee on machine learning, is that the biggest disruption that we've experienced in the last 5 to 10 years has been the emergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's really, really changed the dynamics of the modeling landscape, and it will continue to change the dynamics of the modeling landscape moving forward. One of my colleagues is the director of forecasting at a major forecasting organization worldwide. They manage a number of employees, and he's had to deal with this change. And he made two rules. They made two rules. The first rule was that everybody has to be machine learning literate. People don't have to be a machine learning expert, but everybody has to be machine learning literate. They have to understand what that technology can do, and not continue ostrich-like with their head in the sand. The second rule that they made was that nobody is allowed to write code by themselves anymore. Everybody has to collaborate with a bot in the way that they write code. And that's providing that anecdote as an example as how disruptive this technology has been. It's really changing the way that we do things. When we're thinking about machine learning, so I'll just back up. I've got my own definitions of machine learning and artificial intelligence. For me, effective ways to improve the predictive capacity. For artificial intelligence, my definition is that artificial intelligence takes over tasks that were traditionally done by humans. So as an example, LSTM would be a machine learning tool, and ChatGPT would be artificial intelligence. For machine learning, it's a tool, but it's not a panacea. So what I'm seeing for the future, where we've got to now tremendous accuracy from machine learning algorithms, but now we're beginning to gain a lot more capability to mix machine learning with physics. So what I see over the next at least 5 to 10 years is the emergence of hybrid methods that provide the accuracy and that we get from machine learning algorithms, plus the interpretability that we need in order to use the predictions effectively. For artificial intelligence, it can simplify tasks to a huge degree, but we really need to understand the dangers and the over-reliance on AI tools. We need to understand where the biases are. If we're going to a new region where that doesn't have data that was trained on, what could be some of the problems? What are some of the hallucinations that could occur, through AI methods? Embrace the tools, but really, really think about how they can be used effectively and where they can cause problems.
Yeah, I really like your definition of machine learning and AI, Martin. It's absolutely really good. The difference between AI and machine learning.
Thank you for that, Martin and Melanie. I have the next question, and this one is directly for Melanie. And then Martin, if you do have any thoughts you'd like to add, you're welcome to after. Melanie, how do advancements in bathymetric data and land surface modeling contribute to better flood risk assessment and climate adaptation work?
Donc, je vais y aller sur la portion bathymétrie, puis je vais laisser Lance
Okay,
Surface
I
Modeling.
will answer the portion on bathymetry and I will leave land modeling to Martin. It is quite difficult to measure bathymetry everywhere in a river. And for many rivers, bathymetry changes with time. So what we're trying to do is to develop efficient methods of data acquisition to reduce cost and to have data where they are relevant. So I think adding or measuring bathymetry in an appropriate manner and sharing bathymetric data, as I was saying, or making it more public is going to enable us to reduce uncertain model or hydrodynamic models uncertainties, because with hydrodynamic models, if we have better data, we do not need as many parameters as in surface schemes models. If we have the necessary data, we can adjust the few parameters that we want, and therefore we are going to reduce the uncertainty of models. That is why I think we should invest more in data acquisition.
Thank you. And I think it's clear that I'm on the interpreter's channel, so it takes me a minute after you finish. Thank you, Melanie. And Martin, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest advance that we're seeing at the moment is that now it's possible to do work faster. A lot of the tools that we've got, a lot of the advances that we've got in configuring models and interoperability and reusability, etc. Even with some of the AI tools that we have, we can spend so much more time on addressing the science problem than we used to. So that's changing the work that we do in academics, and I'm sure that it's going to have big impacts on the consulting community as well.
Thank you.
I'll move on to the last question for our panel discussion before we go back to the Q&A. So if you have any questions for the Q&A in the meantime, feel free to add them into the Q&A chat. So the question is, what are the key limitations in current modeling techniques and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, you want to start? Okay. Bon, j'ai déjà mentionné que
I've already mentioned that bathymetry of a river can change in a hydrodynamic modeling. So what we want is recent data that could help adjust the model. So we want data that have a few years or that are a few years or less. We also want to measure extreme events, rare events, to be able to validate hydrodynamic models. And in an ideal world, we will have more than enough observations to calibrate and validate the model. So if you listen to me keenly, my recommendation is to have many or several recent extreme events, which is quite impossible. If I want recent extreme events, they're not rare because they're no longer recent. So this is a paradox that can never be addressed in hydrodynamic modeling, especially for mobile rivers. So this is one of our limitations. How do we address this gap, or how do we reduce this shortcoming? We can do this by diversifying our data sources. We are currently looking at the water level, but we could also use SPIV, water speed, and other variables to be able to measure our models, and not only limiting ourselves to water level, but we remember that what we are looking at is to have recent extreme events, and it is a limitation in itself of our model.
I can add on to that as well, if it's useful. One of the biggest challenges that we've had, and I'm sorry to harp on this, over the past few decades in hydrological modeling has been large domain parameter estimation. It was viewed as the prediction and ungauged basins problem, that's known as the PUB problem, that was being tackled by many investigators worldwide with no real resolution to it. What we're seeing now, I wouldn't say that the PUB problem is solved, but we're now seeing optimism that we've got a path forward to substantially improve our capabilities for large domain parameter estimation. Another key limitation that we have is uncertainty quantification. This is especially in the climate adaptation space. A lot of the uncertainties that we have are unknowable, and they're epistemic in nature and difficult to characterize using probability distributions. So thinking about that, thinking about how we can use storylines of change, how we can use scenarios in meaningful ways is important. To build on one of the comments that Melanie made, I don't think that we're using the data sources that are available as well as we could. We use a lot of streamflow information, and often, we're tied to the streamflow information, but there's many data sets, field data, snow data sets, satellite data products, etc., that we could begin to use in much more clever ways than we haven't done previously. The final limitation that I'll add is the importance of open science. And I think if I can editorialize just a little bit, this is incredibly important now, given the political transitions that we're seeing in different parts of the world. Whereas we need to make sure that we're not overly dependent on specific data sets in order to ensure that we can make meaningful prediction products. So I'll just leave it there and then pass it back to the organizers. But thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Melanie, as well. We are now going to transition into our Q&A. We thank the attendees for submitting such great questions. Keep them coming. At this point, if you would also like to ask the questions live, please use the raise hand function on Zoom, and we can allow you to unmute and ask the speakers your question live. I do see one in the Q&A from anonymous attendee. What do you think about the Google Flood tool that is LSTM-based machine learning tool, particularly in ice-impacted rivers where ice jams abruptly increase the water level?
Yeah. So I think you're talking about the Google Flood Hub. So I'm quite familiar with that tool, and I'm familiar with the people who have been developing that tool. They have been able to show substantial increases in skill over traditional forecasting methods. There's a wonderful paper that was led by Gray Nering, I think it was in Nature, and that came out a few months ago, that was documenting those improvements. The machine learning tools have got immense power and extrapolation. It's often viewed that the power of extrapolation is limited, but the way that the big data has been used, the machine learning tools are often performing better for extrapolation than traditional hydrological models. That said, and ice-impacted rivers is just one example. Prairie potholes is another example. Like glacier dynamics is another example. We need the processor backbone in these tools in order for them to be used effectively everywhere. That's why I'm arguing for hybrid AI tools that can be used so that we have not only the accuracy but also the interpretability that we need. I see anonymous. I'd love to know who anonymous attendee is. I think that we could have some wonderful discussions over coffee. There's the second one with the advancement of AI and hybrid AI physics approaches. Do you think AI will eventually replace physically based models, or will they continue to coexist as complementary tools in the future? No, I think what we're seeing now is that hybrid is the future. That's my opinion. But and unless there's some revolutions that we can't anticipate, which is always the case. But what I'm seeing, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, is that hybrid models will play an increasingly important role in operational prediction.
Thank you, Martin. And I have a feeling it's the same anonymous attendee, but I'm not sure. And they're just wondering if you can put the link to the paper that you referred in the chat, maybe later on.
Yeah, I can do that if Melanie wants to answer the second question by Jasmine.
Which on the machine learning or AI?
We have a question from Jasmine King, Melanie.
Okay.
Could you please comment on uncertainty propagation and management through these large modeling frameworks that utilizes a vast set of different data, many non-stationary? How should that be built into flood risk management and decision-making processes by funding agencies and government bodies? Our current policy paradigm is based on a deterministic product. How can we move towards probabilistic decision-making?
Ouais, je pense qu'on pourrait en discuter longtemps.
I think this is a discussion that will take us hours. When we talk of uncertainty propagation in floodplain mapping, we have uncertainty from hydrological models and uncertainty from hydrodynamic models. We also have observation uncertainties, which sometimes tend to forget this, but there is an uncertainty related to data. So, of course, research must be carried out on how to propagate these uncertainties, especially as we are in a non-stationary climate and the data that we use are non-stationary.
Est-ce qu'il y a une solution actuellement
Is there currently a solution
pour aller vers des modèles probabilistes?
To move from determined models to probabilistic models? I think according to research, we are moving towards probabilist or probabilistic models, but
satisfaire les gens qui
we're not sure if the latter are going to be satisfactory for decision makers.
On pense aux assureurs, etc.
Regarding insurance and land use planning, I don't know if we've already reached that level. According to me, the question is really a philosophical one.
Sur laquelle on peut arriver à une réponse.
It is not really a question that for which we can provide an answer currently, because there are many challenges that are raised. First, on uncertainty propagation, the non-stationary aspect of data and climate, and the probabilistic aspect that needs to be considered in decision making. These are elements that hopefully over the coming years will be addressed. Martin.
Yeah, no, just to build on this a little bit, we talked about it before. It's really important to think about what uncertainty is knowable and what uncertainty is not. And think about the different types of prediction problems that we have and the different types of policy and management responses. For short-term flood forecasts, for example, a lot of the uncertainty can be knowable, and that we can quantify the uncertainty using probability distributions that are ascribed to different parts of the modeling process, and use probabilistic forecasts to make risk assessments. In other cases, when we're thinking about climate change on decadal timescales, a lot of the uncertainty sources that we have are not knowable, and we need to recognize that those uncertainty sources are not knowable in the policy responses that we have.
Thank you both. I can see there's still a great number of attendees with us, so I'll just pause for a second so folks have time to type in their questions if they have any. remaining. If you'd like to ask your question live, please raise your hand and we can allow you to ask them live. I want to thank the speakers again for presenting with us today and answering all these great questions. Really appreciate your time and your contribution to this webinar series. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything, but I'll hold it a little bit longer. In the meantime, I'll cover some of our closing remarks. The recording of this webinar will be available on our website. Thank you again for spending your afternoon with us, and we hope you will join us for other webinars in this series. We will post some links in the chat for some relevant topics that we've covered today, including some upcoming events. Hannah earlier had included a link to a short survey regarding the webinar. I'm going to launch that now. Your feedback is valuable and really helps us improve future sessions. So thank you for taking a quick minute or so to share your thoughts. In the meantime, we are going to turn off our videos now and leave the webinar running for a couple of minutes so you have some time for the webinar survey, as well as take a look at any of the links that we've pulled in the chat. So on behalf of CWRA and our team, have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.